Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Joe, we kick off this week in geopolitical news with a series of developments in regard to Israel. As we've mentioned, Netanyahu has dissolved his war cabinet. They also have decided to pursue some tactical pauses to allow humanitarian aid into Gaza. And interesting, after we just saw Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, completing his 8th trip to the Middle East since October 7th, a new envoy is now in the Middle East, Amos Hochstein, who, of course, is frequently here on Bloomberg TV and radio to talk about energy policy.
Yeah, interesting that one of the president's closest energy advisors, the most recent to get the call, to basically leverage the relationships he has in the region. He may not be the Secretary of State, but he seems to be the man of the moment. CIA Director Bill Burns has fallen into that role more than once, and this really brings us more to the idea of avoiding a new front to the north in a war with Hezbollah, which is something that Amos Hochstein is there talking about. And Courtney McBride is here talking with us from Bloomberg's national security team. Courtney, of course, covers the State Department, the administration, geopolitics, and diplomacy for us. It's great to see you back at the table here. Amos Hochstein, rising to the surface here. What can he unlock for this administration?
Absolutely. Well, thank you both for having me here today. Amos Hochstein is really trying to leverage, as you said, those relationships to prevent another full front in the war from opening to the north between Israel and Lebanon. And really, he's able to speak with leaders in both places to try to cool tensions and continue the ongoing efforts by the administration to keep the war from spreading even further into a full-scale regional conflagration.
It's pretty stunning, Courtney, that obviously a lot of us have spent so much time in recent weeks trying to dissect and calculate the odds of some kind of temporary ceasefire being reached between Israel and Hamas to essentially stop the fighting in Gaza. All the while, it seems that others were focused pretty intensely on making sure that it doesn't cross other borders, like with Lebanon. Is there a feeling that it is more at risk of happening now in this moment than at any other time since this conflict began?
I don't know that I would say that necessarily, but there have been periods where the risk is assessed to be greater of an escalation. And, as you said, the ceasefire conversations are ongoing, but perhaps stalled. And in the interim, you do have this unilateral pause by Israel to allow for greater delivery of humanitarian assistance.
So talk to us about this 8 a.m. to 7 p.m., a tactical pause that comes in lieu of a ceasefire. What has brought Benjamin Netanyahu to this point, and could this tactically expand into something bigger?
There's always the possibility and the hope, certainly from the Biden administration, that we do still see a ceasefire that is a mutually agreed end to hostilities. But this is an entirely separate issue. This is not something negotiated with Hamas. In fact, Hamas leadership claimed that they were left out of the conversation. But this is something that the Israeli government has determined that it can do and needs to do to allow more aid to flow.
Are they acknowledging these reports of famine on an official level by doing this?
I don't know that they're doing that necessarily, but the IDF is assessing that there is an opportunity to pause their operations, which are perhaps winding down at that heightened level in the Rafah area as well.
So when we think about the Israeli government and the composition of it right now, how significant is it, Courtney, that the war cabinet has been dissolved? Is that more symbolic than anything else, or is that actually likely to change the trajectory of Israel's conduct in this conflict moving forward?
I don't know that we can necessarily predict how this is going to affect the conduct of the war by the Israeli government, but it certainly is a massive shift. Over the last several months, this is the organization, this is the group that has run the war effort, and it's no secret that it's been composed of individuals who are often politically at odds.
Getting back to where we started with Antony Blinken, is he planning a 9th trip? How's the administration taking this?
Well, that's not necessarily something that I'm ever told, but but
based on the way you've seen them work, though, this is something that's just going to be a rolling visit, it seems like, from him.
I mean, they tend to travel when there's an opportunity to meet with interlocutors who may be able to push things forward.
Yeah.
So if whether it's ceasefire negotiations, hostage releases, if there is something that can perhaps be achieved, that's usually when we're on a plane to distant places.
Yeah.
Well, I wonder if in the month of July, the need to go to the Middle East perhaps is superseded by Netanyahu's own visit to the U.S. as he's scheduled address a joint session of Congress. And perhaps that presents another opportunity to meet.
That's going to be an interesting moment. We've talked to a lot of lawmakers, and to be clear, Democratic lawmakers who said they're either struggling with this or they might not attend that speech to Congress. That's a big deal, though, for Benjamin Netanyahu. Can the administration use that as a point of leverage to get something else here?
They're certainly, I think, going to seize the opportunity to speak with Prime Minister Netanyahu when he is in town. But what they attempt to achieve is anyone's guess.
All right, Courtney McBride playing the guessing game with us here on Balance of Power.
She knows the answer to all of these. It's just a question of whether she wants to tell us.
It's just hedging.
Courtney,
Courtney, we appreciate it. She reports on national security for us here at Bloomberg. We want to add a new voice to this conversation as well now and turn to Kailey Grieco. She is Stimson Center Senior Fellow with the Reimagining U.S. Grand Strategy Program. Welcome back to Balance of Power, Kailey. Always great to have you. If we could first begin with these 11-hour tactical pauses that Israel is now putting into place, trying to get that humanitarian aid in. How do you read into that tactical decision and whether it's one that could ultimately expand beyond 11-hour windows of time?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. Yes, so I think, there are a couple of things here. One is that there is a tempo to operations, and Israel has been engaged in some very intense operations, and you can't really sustain that momentum long term. And so this may be a natural time when it's regrouping, and so it allows for this kind of pause anyway. So I think that's one. But the second thing I think is I can't imagine this sort of converting itself into a long-term ceasefire because Israel wants to obtain hostages. It wants to rescue hostages in any kind of deal with Hamas. And so giving away this ceasefire for free in some sense doesn't really serve Israel's interests.
Why haven't we seen more raids then, Kailey? We talked about one involving 4 hostages who were rescued at the expense, according to Hamas, of more than 250 Palestinians during that raid. Are we going to see more activity like that, or do they simply not know where the hostages are?
Yeah, I mean, I think this has been an intense debate about this exact issue, which is one, it is an intelligence challenge, of course, of knowing where they're located and being able to safely do this, meaning that you don't kill the hostages in the process. So that is certainly a challenge. And then the second part is there's been suggestions, it's very contentious inside Israel, of whether the government is really prioritizing the rescue of hostages, or if it's more focused on really combating Hamas itself. And that, of course, has been a real source of contention within Israeli society.
Well, and now it seems there is an open question, Kailey, about not just going to bat against Hamas, but Hezbollah as well. We were just talking about Amos Hochstein from the administration in the region now, trying to make sure that things don't escalate on the northern border with Lebanon. How concerned would you be in this moment about another front opening up?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is very concerning. What we're seeing is this slow-moving escalation since October 7th. And in a way, because it's so slow-moving, you can sort of almost fool yourself into thinking it won't happen. But what we're seeing is that a series of sort of escalating attacks in scale and in terms of intensity over especially the last couple weeks. And so I don't think either side necessarily wants to get into a full-scale war, but we're in a really, I think, dangerous period where neither side may consciously start a war, but could inadvertently do so. And certainly the rhetoric on both sides is very intense. And I think this mission by Hochstein is there in particular to try to tell the Israelis to not, consider launching some kind of limited ground invasion into Lebanon. This certainly, if that were to happen, would create a lot of problems for the United States, in particular in terms of being able to support the Israelis, even in terms of weapons and equipment.
Yeah. Well, that's my question here. To what extent would that further complicate U.S. relations with Iran? Would that put the U.S. in a more precarious position than it is with Hamas?
Yeah, I think that is absolutely right. I mean, the relationship between Hamas and Iran is not as close as the relationship between Iran and Hezbollah. And so I think the possibility of Iran intervening far more directly, if there was an intervention between Israel into Lebanon, is far more likely. Iran has certainly signaled that's far more likely to take action if there was a war between Israel and Hezbollah. And so I think, we're trying to avoid a regional conflict. And so that danger becomes far more heightened if we actually see this war be taken to Lebanon. And that's something we've been trying so actively to avoid. And the United States, really, the kinds of trade-offs would become so acute for the United States. We're trying to support a war in Ukraine. We have, significant concerns in the Indo-Pacific. And if this becomes a regional conflict, trying to do all of this is frankly not possible to support all of these allies and partners. And it would really create really acute trade-offs very quickly.
Yeah, it's an excellent point, Kelly. There are so many hot conflicts that the U.S. is paying acute attention to right now, including, as you just mentioned, Ukraine. And I would like to ask you about Vladimir Putin's trip to North Korea this week. The first time he has gone there since the year 2000. Of course, there's been a lot of reporting of suspicions that Kim Jong-un's regime has been sending missiles to Russia to allow it to continue its war in Ukraine. How do you view this visit and the relationship between these two leaders?
Yes, well, I mean, this is a marriage of convenience. Putin has turned to Kim Jong-un to be able to get, old stockpiles that the North Koreans have of lots of artillery, including, it seems, some short-range ballistic missiles. And these are systems that are compatible with old Soviet equipment. What this has allowed for the Russians is essentially to use these sort of millions of artillery rounds that have been provided to sustain them while they're building up their own industrial production. And in exchange, this has been a good deal for Kim. He's gotten lots of economic aid, it seems, some technology around space satellites, and including apparently a luxury limousine has been sent to Kim as well. And it's certainly, it's increased his image on the international stage.
Fascinating. Considering what North Korea is providing, are they just filling the gap that China has left? Didn't Vladimir Putin try to get all of this initially from Beijing?
Yes, that's exactly right. And I think it's worth noting that the quality of this is in question from what we know on the battlefield, but that certainly provides some information for the North Koreans. And from what we know, the Chinese are not particularly happy about this relationship. There was some reporting suggesting that the Chinese explicitly asked Putin not to go directly from their May visit when Putin went to Beijing, to go directly to North Korea, because they don't want it looking like the new axis of evil in the West. They would like to create some distance. And I don't think it's an accident that Putin is visiting North Korea and then he's visiting Vietnam, again, to sort of maybe create a little bit of distance so that it doesn't look as though there's some anti-Western bloc forming. Whether that will be successful is another matter. But this creates some headaches for Beijing.
Of course, Kelly, all of this is coming in the aftermath of the G7 in Italy last week, in which we saw not only the countries agreeing to use frozen Russian assets to provide a $50 billion loan to Ukraine, but the signing of this 10-year security agreement between the U.S. and Ukraine. How significant is that really if it's not an enforceable treaty?
Yeah, you said exactly the right thing, which is it's not an enforceable treaty. So it's largely symbolic, in my opinion. It's symbolic politics, and that's about it. If this was something that was to go to Congress and be a treaty, that would be a different matter. But any president could come in and overturn it. So symbolic politics.
Well, we're going into an interesting time, as we've been discussing, Kelly, politically speaking here. The next month will walk us up to the Republican convention. We're going to have a number of important things that take place in the midst of it, including a presidential debate. To what extent are the stories we're talking about, Israel and Ukraine, going to be featured in that debate, if at all?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would think, I always think that the economy is the most important thing first, but I do think this is actually an election year where foreign policy will matter quite a bit. Because it's taking up so many headlines in the news on a regular basis. And because the contrast is so stark. And Biden has used so much of his presidency to create this contrast, really emphasizing his relationships with allies and partners. And he's going to want to feature that. And I think Trump will want to feature his different approach, which is saying that he thinks, that the United States is being taken for a ride and is doing too much in the world. And that there is a real important debate that the two candidates can have on these issues.
I suspect you'll hear something about endless wars. Kailey Grieco, thank you for being with us, as always, senior fellow at the Reimagining U.S. Grand Strategy Program at the Stimson Center, with us on Balance of Power, the Monday edition. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz. 1 month to the Republican National Convention. It's kind of crazy to think about. We got less than 2 weeks to the debate.
Yep. Next Thursday, of course, it's this Thursday that Joe Biden's going to make his way to Camp David to start preparations.
Yep.
Unclear what kind of preparations Trump and his campaign are doing, but we're all just counting down the days until those two share a stage in the swing state of Georgia.
Said it. Absolutely. In the meantime, the Biden campaign is deploying some money. A big ad buy we'll talk about next with our panel. Rick and Jeanne are with us on the Monday edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
We are counting down the days to June 27th. The first presidential debate between Joe Biden and Donald Trump set to take place in Atlanta next Tuesday. And between now and then, voters, especially in swing states, are going to be seeing a new ad from President Biden setting the stage for the debate that specifically focuses on Donald Trump's record in court and his recent 34 convictions on felony counts of falsifying business records. This is a $50 million ad buy. And here is a little clip.
This election is between a convicted criminal who's only out for himself and a president who's fighting for your family.
The ad, Joe, is titled Character Matters.
Yeah, that's the race there, I guess, in the eyes of the Biden campaign. It's between a convicted criminal out for himself or this president who is fighting for families. $50 million is a good chunk of cash, and it's where we start our conversation with our signature panel. Jeanne, Zaino, and Rick Davis are with us, Bloomberg Politics contributors. There have been a lot of questions, Jeanne, about when Joe Biden was going to put the money to work. This is the most recent example. This approach, character matters. Matters to whom?
They want it to matter to voters in these swing states. And I think the key here is the tagline that we keep hearing, only out for himself. The reality is we heard that from Jill Biden, the first lady, at the big fundraiser over the weekend. And we've heard it from the campaign managers. Donald Trump, is only out for himself. The conviction is making him, even more animated and energized to get back in office so he can, try to pardon himself, which he can't from a state trial. But the reality is they want to make this case on everything from the convictions to the economy, that this is all about Trump and his billionaire friends. So I think it's something we're going to hear a lot in the coming weeks.
Well, Donald Trump may be a billionaire, Rick, but we've been talking this entire cycle thus far about his cash disadvantage when it comes to the Biden campaign. He had a really big month of May, though. We still haven't gotten May figures from Biden. We know he raised $30 million in Hollywood just this weekend with George Clooney and Barack Obama beside him. But a $50 million ad buy is a pretty big chunk of the war chest. Is that a wise financial decision?
I think it's questionable. Clearly, running ads in the summer is less effective than husbanding your resources and running them in the fall. It's pretty clear that voters tune in September when trees start to change and people start thinking about the election. That being said, I think the Biden campaign is rightly concerned about their standing in the polls. They're rightly concerned about the positioning that the candidate is in, which is generally been trailing Donald Trump for the last 6 months. And I think they're trying to do something about it, especially before all the attention on the debates and the conventions. And so, long story short, yeah, I think he's going to roll the dice. He's going to spend $50 million. I think they think money's not going to be the issue in closing this campaign, and they got to do what they can to try and get the candidate back in a better position, which in this case means driving negatives up on Donald Trump. This ad's not going to help Joe Biden get more popular, but it may help drive Donald Trump down to be less popular than Joe Biden.
Huh. And to that end, new numbers today from Ipsos and Politico magazine. Interesting, Jeanne. We've seen a bit of research since Donald Trump's conviction, but not enough to really understand a trend, if there is one. In this case, 21% of independents said the conviction made them less likely to support Donald Trump. So is this campaign just about reminding them this happened?
It is partly about that. And yeah, the idea that they're finding in this poll that his conviction, despite the big amount of money they've raised off of it, could be a liability when people go to the polls is, what we're beginning to see in some of this polls. I don't think this is something we can take to the bank, so to speak, at this point, because we've also seen some numbers suggesting Donald Trump is doing better after the conviction. But this is a fairly hopeful, if you will, sign for the Biden team that they should keep talking about the idea of a convicted felon serving as president being something that most voters will not, or many voters in the independent lane will not countenance. And the other interesting thing I think we should pay attention to is Donald Trump losing support amongst 65 plus. His numbers amongst seniors are down. A Republican has not lost 65 plus since before 2000. So the idea that his numbers are down there even a little bit and in swing states, that's a big problem for Donald Trump and a big win for Joe Biden. So there have been some of these positive signs, mildly positive, I would say, in the polling numbers we're seeing in the last few weeks.
Rick, what's your take on these figures? As mentioned, 21% of independents said the conviction is important to how they will vote, and it means they are less likely to support Trump. Perhaps not surprisingly, 40% of Democrats had that answer. Only 7% of Republicans, the total being 22%. But when we're talking about such a small portion of the electorate that is likely to decide the outcome, Rick, are those numbers enough?
It just depends on which state. I would say in states like the blue wall states of Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, where the numbers have been in a dead heat, you're looking for sort of what positives you can find. This is a positive, right? This could be 25,000, 100,000 people per state who might be less likely to vote. I think part of what this poll also told us, the Ipsos poll asked you, and is this a very important item? Because we know a lot of people would be less likely to vote if they knew the candidate you were running against was a criminal. But does that really make a big difference to them in their decision? And a substantial number, almost 20%, said yes. So that is really interesting to me that someone would actually decide the outcome of their vote on this conviction. So I think in those states, it's critically important. In states where they've migrated to 5-10 points difference between each other, it's just on the margins at that stage. But right now, I don't think you can really rely on anybody's polls but the candidates. And clearly, Biden took a poll and tested this and said it's worth investing $50 million behind a message because they see it helping them.
Rick, I wonder your thoughts on the optics over the weekend. Donald Trump in Detroit asking black voters for their support. Joe Biden out west in California sharing a stage with the Glitterati. He was there with Barack Obama, Jimmy Kimmel on stage. Julia Roberts was there, George Clooney. As the man behind the famous celebrity ad that John McCain ran against Barack Obama, do you see an opening here?
Look, I think they're just chasing the changes in the electorate. I mean, we've been talking about Joe Biden's electorate now being older, whiter, more educated, more likely to be influenced by Hollywood than Donald Trump's, who is more working class, lacks college education, and frankly more multicultural. I mean, he is picking up especially young black males into his coalition. He could wind up receiving 20% of that vote in the election, which would be a really amazing historical level for a Republican candidate. And so it has as much to do with education as it does with color. It has as much to do with location, living outside of cities versus in them. And so I think this was a perfect weekend. It shows you really how the parties have become restructured to the point where it's starting to show up in the things that they do and the contrasts they make. Hollywood versus, a black church in the Midwest.
Well, and with this Hollywood event, as we mentioned, about $30 million was raised by the Biden campaign. Jeanne, the FEC deadline to put in fundraising data for the month of May is later this week. We already heard from the Trump campaign several weeks ago, $141 million raised in May, in large part off the back of his guilty verdict. Does it concern you that we haven't heard anything from the Biden campaign yet? We might not until they actually are forced to by that deadline?
Yeah, I think that we're waiting to see. I mean, it would be really tough to match what the Trump campaign was able to do. Those were big numbers. That said, the 28 million over the weekend was historic on the Democratic side. And I think also important about that event, putting the celebrities aside, was the message that Joe Biden was able to get out, which is a warning about the impact on the court if Donald Trump wins, which is likely two more appointees who are going to solidify a conservative majority, likely to take away key freedoms and rights until your grandkids and great grandkids potentially are adults. I mean, this is a really important message that they're underscoring, and I think we're going to hear more about that. So the celebrities were fascinating, but the message is critical, and they've got to use this money they're raising to get that message out. Democrats don't traditionally vote on the court, but given we're at the 2-year anniversary of Dobbs, that's what we've seen happening in the last 24 months.
All right, Jeanne, Sheehan, Zaino, and Rick Davis, our Bloomberg Politics contributors, kicking things off for us on this Monday. Thank you so much.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
An interesting week for news in the Middle East as we turn our attention back to the campaign trail, and you can't have one story without the other to the extent that Israel has resonated on the campaign for Joe Biden and has created a real deficit, we're told, by a lot of pollsters when it comes specifically to young voters, but progressive Democrats of all ages and many people of color. And this is a problem for Joe Biden, knowing how close things are. Just one of many things I wanted to talk out with Don Levy. It's always a pleasure to spend some time with the director of the Siena College Research Institute. When you hear about the Siena College New York Times poll, this is the man behind it. Don, it's great to see you. I hope you had a great Father's Day, and welcome back to Bloomberg. This conversation we're having about Israel right now remains a problem for a lot of young voters. Is it still the flashpoint that it was a couple of weeks ago, as people are reminded of their short memories?
It's certainly one of the flashpoints. I mean, Biden has a problem with the young vote. There's no question about it. It's a vote that he carried by about 23 points in 2020 in our most recent polling across the nation, as well as the battleground states. It's really a toss-up. You know, Biden's up by 1 point with young people, and certainly when we ask young people, who do you sympathize with more in the war between Israel and Hamas, and young people, by a plurality, say they sympathize much more with the Palestinians. So they're looking for a ceasefire. They're looking for Biden to insert himself and to protect the lives of the Gazan people.
To what extent is this driving people of color into Donald Trump's category? Because there's a big conversation right now, and it's had every day just about on this program, about Joe Biden losing his grip, it seems, on the black vote and the appeal that Donald Trump has. He was in a church in Detroit over the weekend and dropped a line we've heard a lot of times, Don. He says he's done more for the black community in this country than any president since Abraham Lincoln. Are you actually seeing this bear itself out in the numbers?
Well, that's certainly not a question that we've asked in a poll, but I think what we're seeing in our polling is you've got to, again, differentiate older black voters from younger black voters. Older black voters most especially older Black women, have been an extremely reliable group for Democrats in general and Biden specifically, and he continues to retain support amongst Black voters over the age of 50. Where he's had an erosion, and when you see numbers where about 20% of the Black vote now is telling us, pollsters, that they're going to vote for Trump, that's amongst young Black voters. And really the key there is not the situation in the Middle East, but it's the economy. Young voters in general are extremely unhappy with the state of the economy. They don't approve the job that Joe Biden is doing on the economy. They think Donald Trump is a better steward of the economy, and that's especially true amongst all young voters and of young Black voters. That's where Biden's erosion really is being generated.
Interesting. It's good to get specific on these things, certainly when you're talking to Don Levy. Fascinating take from Pew Research, Don, on something you've talked about here more than once. The elusive, or not so elusive as it turns out, double hater. Those who say they don't like either major party presidential candidate. I wouldn't vote for Trump or Biden. It turns out, according to Pew, that it makes up a quarter of the electorate, and that's an all-time high. How do you play with that going into a cycle here, Don? I just mentioned we're going to be at the first convention 1 month from today. And in that time, there will be the big debate. There will be Donald Trump's sentencing and probably a number of other things that can turn people's attention one way or the other here, including the naming of a vice presidential candidate. What do the double haters do with all of that?
Well, let's turn it on its head for just 1 second, Joe. Let's talk about the love haters for a second. Those people who have a favorable view of one of the candidates and an unfavorable view of the others. As you point out, that's about 3/4 of the electorate, and their votes are already almost etched in granite. Amongst the love haters, they are with their candidate at the rate of about 95-1. Those folks are not going to switch. And if the election today were held only amongst the love haters, though that 75% view one candidate favorably and the other unfavorably, Trump is up in the battleground states by about 4 points. When you turn now to our friends, the double haters, who have a negative view of both of them, that group of people did tend to vote for Biden in the last election. Right now, they favor Biden by about 10 or 11 points nationally, by about 8 points in the battleground states, but they're unhappy. They're desperately unhappy with the economy. They do tend to be younger, but at the same time, they are ardently in favor of abortion rights. So they are up for grabs. Now, some of those voters appear likely to leak off to a third-party candidate. RFK is pulling in some of them. Biden, no doubt, is counting on being able to bring home some of those double haters who had voted for him in 2020. Right now, they don't approve of Joe Biden. Biden's approval rating amongst young double haters is 9 points approve and 88 points disapprove. So Biden's got his work cut out for him to bring those double haters, especially those young double haters, back home. And no doubt that's why he's bringing out some of the cultural icons, some politicians who are seen more favorably amongst those double haters to try to get those folks to come back into the Biden fold.
Well, yeah, think about the weekend we just had, and I wonder how you play the optics in your head here if we step away from the numbers for just a moment with Don Levy. We saw the optics of President Biden on stage out in California, razzle-dazzle, lots of stars. Julia Roberts is there. Jimmy Kimmel's got him on stage with Barack Obama. And granted, I'm seeing lots of videos of him, quote-unquote, freezing on the stage, and it doesn't seem that that's actually what happened. The contrast of Donald Trump going to Detroit and asking black voters to support him is great. If we zoom the lens out even wider, some of the things that Donald Trump said at his rally over the weekend really paint a picture here of the contest that we're looking at. Do voters care about the optics that I describe?
Well, I think both candidates, in some senses, they understand. They understand that probably 75% of the vote is already baked in. And so they're really competing for a very small slice of the electorate. And you slice that even thinner when you realize that it's only in 6 or 7 states. So they're trying everything they can to sway those double haters, the young voters, to try to convince older voters. Older voters had been more in Trump's camp, and older voters now are migrating over to some degree to Biden. It's really quite interesting that at this point, when you talk to older voters, they're starting to say that Biden is the more conservative candidate, and that speaks to them. Whereas young voters are looking for radical change. They want everything changed in our government. Older voters do not, and older voters are concerned about Social Security, medical issues, and that right now they're starting to see Biden protecting those more so than Trump. So we've seen a bit of an inversion, at least in polling right now, where younger voters are moving away from Biden, but older voters are moving towards him right now.
Fascinating. I've only got a minute left. Don, you mentioned RFK Jr. I just wonder if he finds his way onto the debate stage, how much of a threat that will be for the front runners here, how disruptive that could be to the race.
Well, it's certainly a threat, and it's a threat to both of them because, again, you're looking at that thin slice of these double haters who, and you got to remember, they don't like either of the major party candidates. So another opportunity, another option appeals to them. At this point in time in the campaign, the rationale that says, hey, you'd be wasting a vote, that candidate can't win, you're really, a spoiler, that doesn't resonate yet. As you said, we're looking at the debate, we're looking at the sentencing, we're looking at the conventions. These double haters are going to have to start making up their mind, but many of them probably won't until we get past Don. Labor Day. So we're going to continue to talk about them until then.
Don Levy, it's great to have you back. Are there triple haters? This is Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Charlie, do you have Alexa in your house? You ask Alexa questions, or does Alexa spy on you from time to time?
I do not, but even better than that, my wife has me in the house. She asks questions, and I don't always know the answer. So.
Well, I bet you do more often than Alexa sometimes. I always love asking or talking about Alexa on the air because everyone lets me know when they start talking back in their house because the show is on. Hey, Alexa. Sorry, I had to. The Washington Post had questions, Kailey Leinz, for Alexa when it came to politics. And I've never talked to Alexa about politics before. I don't know if you have, no. And couldn't figure out who won the 2020 election by asking Alexa.
Yeah, and this is not an Alexa unique problem. They also asked a number of chatbots, including chatbots built by Microsoft and Google. Google's Gemini, when asked who won the 2020 election, said, I'm still learning how to answer this question. In the meantime, try Google search. Microsoft's Copilot's answer. Looks like I can't respond to this topic.
Yeah.
Explore Bing search results.
So they still kick you back to Bing? Doesn't that defeat the purpose?
Yeah, I guess go figure out for yourself who you think won.
Right.
For the record, Joe Biden did win the 2020 election.
That's right.
We are now in the 2024 election cycle, and apparently AI still is not able to answer what happened the last go-around.
Yeah, forget predicting it.
Perhaps is a little bit concerning. So we figured we should bring in an AI expert to discuss how it's factoring into this election cycle, but also our geopolitical relationships as well. Gregory Allen is joining us here in our Washington, D.C. studio from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where he is the director of the Wadhwani Center for AI and Advanced Technologies. Greg, welcome to Bloomberg. Thank you so much for joining us here in studio. We should be concerned about this, right? We are heading into another election. And AI still can't tell you accurately who won the last one. How is anybody supposed to be relying on it for information?
Well, in this case, you might want to blame people, not AI, because what you're describing in this story reflects a very conscious choice on the part of these companies for how they want to handle this. Now, think about the difference between an AI tool and a classical search engine. A classical search engine is serving you up results and saying, here's what other people have said on this topic relevant to the keywords that you just gave me. Whereas an AI is saying, I, ChatGPT, or I, Alexa, give you this answer. So there's a lot more of the company's brand at stake in answering that question. And some companies have made a conscious choice that they just prefer to not weigh in on this 2020 election issue, and they'd rather refer you to their search engine where other people can express their opinions.
But it also, doesn't that challenge the whole idea, as I've been hearing, that these search engines, they don't even matter anymore. Nobody's going to Google. I've got ChatGPT. I've got my Copilot. That's all I need. And I guess the answer is not so much.
So there's multiple theories for what the future of search looks like and what the future of AI looks like. If you're Microsoft, you've been integrating ChatGPT results with Bing really since the first weeks of the modern AI revolution, since the launch of ChatGPT. But it turns out that large language model results, like those of ChatGPT, are actually much more expensive to serve up than search engine results. So whereas returning a result for search engines might cost a tiny fraction of a penny, returning results for a large language model might cost like 9 or 10 cents, which when you multiply that times hundreds of billions of queries, those are really actually meaningful economics that the companies have to take into account. So right now, the search engine ecosystem and the large language model AI assistant ecosystem are existing side by side, with really more of the economic value, at least at present, still being delivered by classical search engines, which I should mention, if you open them up, they have a lot of AI. It's just older approaches to AI and machine learning rather than the more modern large language model approach.
But when we think specifically about how this is playing into this election cycle, it's not just about asking questions and getting answers. This AI can also be generative. It's creating images and videos, which you aren't automatically able to verify with the naked human eye as to whether or not it's accurate. How concerned should we be about the opportunity for deepfakes or just other disinformation to be circulating AI-powered on social media platforms?
This is something that I worried about a lot during my time in the Department of Defense. I was previously the Director of Strategy and Policy at the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center. And one of the challenges that the DoD was wrestling with was foreign intelligence agencies who were trying to put out fake information, sometimes aided by, computer-generated imagery tools, stuff that we know about from Photoshop, for example. And at the same time, the Internet Research Agency of Russia hired hundreds, at one point even more than 1,000 people to just go write and post disinformation online. The problem was those were native Russian speakers who made a lot of lousy grammatical mistakes, the type that you make when your first language is Russian and your English is pretty bad. What AI can do is it can solve some of those problems that Russian intelligence services had. Rather than needing people who are really good at Photoshop, it can just actually say, AI, please generate me images of the following, thing that would be scandalous if the US military had actually engaged in it. Or AI, please generate 5,000 posts about why Joe Biden is a terrible president that would be suitable for all these platforms. So what you're seeing is the cost and complexity of executing certain types of disinformation attack might be going down. And in fact, we just saw that last month with OpenAI revealing that it had identified multiple foreign intelligence services were already using its platform to generate propaganda.
So it brings us, at least here in Washington, to the conversation about regulation or lack thereof so far. And it's something that Kailey and I got into in a conversation last week with Steve Ballmer, of course, the former CEO of Microsoft. He's got something new called, or not so new at this point, called USA Facts that seeks to educate people in a world of misinformation on how the government actually works. With that in mind, though, listen to his take on the potential impact of regulation.
I don't think regulation is our savior. Probably the right thing is to make sure the legislation is in place so that people who have been violated in some way, whether it's deep fakes or, child harassed through an AI, whatever, that they are clearly prosecutable. That, I think, we need legislation.
What's your take on the approach that Steve Ballmer just suggested and what we've seen already in terms of the infant stages of a conversation with Chuck Schumer, for instance, in the Senate?
Sure. So AI regulation is a really broad topic, and it gets to deep fakes and really every segment of the economy that anybody is thinking about.
What's the first thing we
plugging
need to
AI
get our
into.
arms around?
I would say deepfakes is definitely the one that has the most momentum in Congress. There are several bills that have been introduced by Senator Amy Klobuchar, really looking at tackling multiple sides of the deepfake issue, both the election interference side that we were just talking about a moment ago, as well as child or sexual exploitation that we just heard Steve Ballmer talking about. And in terms of the prosecutable part, this really gets to liability law versus criminal law. And liability law is typically a state-by-state issue. This gets to who can sue whom and under what circumstances. But then you think about what is actually illegal. You ask the question, who's really at fault here? Is it the folks who create the tools that are then misused, or is it the people who are misusing those tools? And you have to come up with standards around what might constitute negligence, what might constitute willful knowledge and intent for malicious conduct. Those are all really thorny questions, the one that Congress is wrestling with right now.
Well, really fascinating. I hope this is the start of a conversation with you. Come back and talk to us soon, because these stories are.
This is not slowing down. Congress is continuing to generate plenty of useful stories on
That's why he's director of the Wadhwani Center for AI and Advanced Technologies, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. Gregory Allen, great conversation. Thanks for being with us. Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.